Hello, everyone. My name is Donna Bishop, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this conversation today on navigating neurodiversity, what to know, and how to support loved ones. Whether you are here in your morning or afternoon, we literally have people joining us from coast to coast to coast and beyond. On behalf of everyone at CAMH, we are so happy you are here. A couple of housekeeping items before we get going. Yes, this is being recorded today, so don't worry, you'll be receiving a copy of this after the webinar. The chat function is a public forum where you can interact with the other participants who are here today. We encourage you to use that throughout today's conversation. If you came with a question, fantastic. You can pop that question in the Ask a Question box at any time. That is a private place for you to submit your questions, maybe right now even, or as they come to you throughout the webinar. We really want to hear what you have to say throughout this conversation. We will be getting to a question and answer portion at the end of our conversation today. And while we can't make personal medical diagnoses or give personal medical advice, we will be covering general themes and general information to help everyone as much as possible. We are just so thrilled that you are here. As we come together from many places today, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which CAMH operates. Even though we're not physically gathered there right now, it remains our responsibility to honor its history and its significance. We acknowledge that CAMH is situated on lands that have been occupied by First Nations for millennia. Lands rich in civilizations with deep knowledge of medicine, architecture, technology, and extensive trade routes throughout the Americas. In 1860, the site of CAMH appeared in the Colonial Records Office of the British Crown as the council grounds for the Mississaugas of the New Credit, as they were known at the time. Today, Toronto is covered by the Toronto Purchase, Treaty Number 13 of 1805, with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This vibrant city is now home to a vast diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who enrich our community immeasurably. CAMH is deeply committed to reconciliation. We honor this land through programs and spaces that reflect and respect its heritage. We embrace the healing traditions of the ancestors, weaving them thoughtfully into our caring practices, and we commit to building meaningful relationships and partnerships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, sharing this land and protecting it for generations to come. It is my pleasure to now introduce you to Dr. Yonda Lenski. We are so lucky to have her here today. Dr. Lenski is the scientific director of the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Center, director of the Healthcare Access Research and Developmental Disabilities Program, and a senior scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health at CAMH here in Toronto. She is also professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Temerty Faculty of Medicine, University of Toronto, is an adjunct scientist at ICES and a clinical psychologist. She works closely with people with developmental disabilities, their families, and disability and healthcare providers to identify healthcare gaps, provide education, and co-design innovative solutions. She offered her healthcare perspective to Special Olympics Canada as a member of their National Board of Directors for 6 years. In addition to being a researcher and a clinician, she is also a sibling to someone with a developmental disability and brings her caregiving lens to her work with Siblings Canada and the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. Dr. Lenski has been studying the mental and physical health of adults with developmental disabilities and their families for more than 25 years and has published over 350 articles on the topic. Dr. Lenski, I cannot think of a better person to be joining us today. Thank you so much for taking time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule to have this webinar with us. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Donna. Really excited for the conversation.
It's going to go by in a flash. So let's dive right in. I think it's important as we begin to just define the container that we're going to be talking about today. Neurodiversity encompasses such a wide swath of experiences and perspectives. So what are some of the terms and kind of main buckets that we need to know about today as we have our conversation?
Sure. So neurodiversity, like you say, it's a big word, and it's really capturing all of us. So if we think about what diversity means. It means there are all kinds of people, right? All kinds of plants, if we're talking about biodiversity. So neurodiversity, all kinds of brains or neuros, right? There's different neurotypes or different ways that people's brains work. And some are what we might call neurotypical. So that's kind of like the standard, average, most common way people think or act. But there's many other ways that people might be. So neurodiversity sort of embraces this idea that we're all different, and that our world needs to recognize difference and value difference. And so there's different conditions, I guess, that are sort of considered within that.
Hmm.
Now, it's not, you don't get a blood test to say that you're neurodivergent, right? Or that you're different from the typical. But there are different diagnoses and things that might go into, like you say, different buckets. But also what some people consider to be neurodivergent, or what some people think counts when we talk about things like neurodiversity, might be different than what other people think. So I've seen different ways of, and that's important, I think, Donna, because when people use that word, it's kind of like, well, what are you talking about, right? I mean, so I sort of embrace this idea of it just meaning diversity or difference in the way people think. But some people might be thinking certain conditions fit in there, and other ones maybe they're not aware of or they're not thinking of as much. So it's
And
as
so,
equal. So go ahead.
no, I was going to say, and some of the conditions that people might be coming with the knowledge of would include ADHD, would include autism. What are some of the other kind of common definitions or common nomenclature that people might be aware of?
Yeah, so I think those two are two big ones that people think about a lot when they use that kind of term, neurodivergent. Some of the conditions we think about, so I work in the area of neurodevelopmental conditions, which would fit under this neurodivergent sort of category, or recognized within neurodiversity. And those conditions are all sort of evident or apparent in the developmental period. So we see them in kids, right? We see them
Right.
ideally probably in young kids. There's some conditions that might fall under there that maybe show up a little bit later in life. So some people think that mental health conditions are considered neurodivergent
Oh,
conditions as well. So I've seen schizophrenia listed as a kind of neurodivergent condition. Some neurological conditions might fit in there, something like Tourette syndrome, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities. So, but yeah, but I think that the essence of it really is just this recognition that people think and behave in different ways, and there
well,
isn't one right way of being.
and how does that impact? Like, I want to make sure we use and illustrate, the language that is the most inclusive and respectful. So as we're talking about neurodivergency, what's how do we approach the language as we're having this conversation?
Yeah. So one thing I say sometimes is that language is, well, it's very personal, isn't it? And it's
Yeah.
always changing. So even the idea of talking about neurodiversity, or I learned more recently talking about people as being either neurodivergent or neurotypical, those are relatively newer terms. We weren't using that kind of language 10 years ago,
Mhm.
right? And the language that we might use in English might be different from the language people are using if they don't speak English, right? So, and not everyone has the same understanding. So I know one thing that's common, whatever words we use, is that I think people are sometimes uncomfortable. They don't want to get the wrong
Yeah.
word. And
Yeah.
then sometimes what do we do when we're uncomfortable? We don't say anything at all, right? But actually, it could be really helpful if we could just ask, like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure, like, am I using the right word here? Is that okay? Would you like me to talk about it in a different way? Because everyone defines themselves differently, right? But this is part of somebody's identity potentially. And so how you speak about it really might mean something to them. With some conditions or ways of being, if we think about autism as an example, that's an interesting one, because years ago we talked about autistic people, and it was a bit of a sort of demeaning kind of way of thinking about people who fell in that sort of category. So we shifted and we talked about people who had autism, people who had an autism diagnosis. And we used to, and there's a term in the DSM, autism spectrum disorder. Well, some people don't like the word disorder, right? What's disordered
Yeah.
about this? This is who I am. This is what's going on with me. Why do we have to use disorder? So some people in the autism community have really embraced this idea of coming back and using sort of identity first language and saying, hey, I'm autistic, right? We see that in the deaf community as well, deaf with a capital D. It's a culture. There's a certain disability pride with certain diagnoses, right? So we speak about them in certain ways, but you might say, okay, well, I've learned I should say autistic. And you say that to someone and then they go really upset. Well, please don't say that. I'd like to be spoken about as someone who has autism, right? So I think everyone is different, and it's based on sort of your experiences and how words have been used before, what you've been taught, and again, your language, your culture.
It's so interesting because it's so fluid.
Yeah,
It's,
it does change. Yeah,
lots of
if you write
change.
down the rules from today and we watch this in 6 months, there might be some differences, or depending where you are and where you live and who you hang out with, there might be differences too.
So people might be joining us today, Dr. Lunsky, because they're looking for some clarity or support around themselves, or perhaps they're supporting a loved one. Maybe they have a child. So I'm going to ask you a really big question, which I know we can't cover, but what exactly is going on in the brain when there is neurodiversity at play? Like, what do we need to kind of understand about the mechanics of our brain that just sort of helps understand what is happening? Or is it as simple as, Donna, everyone's brain is different, let's move on? Like, how would
Um,
you help us understand what is actually happening there?
Okay, so full disclosure, Donna, I'm not an expert on what's going on inside anybody's brain, right? So I don't want to feel like I'm getting things wrong. And I think, but there are people who are studying this so closely, and really understand a lot about different kinds of conditions.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and I think we're really trying to bridge this in our science to understand if we see a certain behavior or way that somebody is, where is that in the brain, right? Can we locate, if you have that particular difference in terms of how you do something, can we find the place in the brain where that kind of shows up and it looks different than another person's brain? And we're getting closer to understanding some of that,
Mhm.
but it's not that clear, right? And also it's not my own sort of area of expertise to understand those pieces. But sometimes I think we do see differences that are really obvious when people are very young, right? With certain kinds of conditions, and we pick it up and we know about it, quite clearly. And sometimes it might
Yeah.
be matched to somebody's genetics. It might also be matched to how somebody looks on the outside, what's going on the inside. And sometimes it's not clear at all, right? So sometimes we're recognizing those things when people are young, and sometimes we're recognizing those things later. And also keeping in mind, we talked before about the fluidity of these terms, right? There's also a fluidity or a change in terms of what we conceptualize as being different and what we understand. So that we might have an understanding of what ADHD looks like now in young kids, but we didn't have that same understanding of how ADHD would look like in young kids 30 years ago, or autism, or even intellectual disability. So that's something that to some people should be quite obvious. I know an intellectual disability, and this is something that I can diagnose, has to do with someone's sort of cognitive skills, how they think about things, how they manage in their day to day, and it has to be evident in that sort of childhood period. But even that definition has changed many times over history. So the actual cutoff, if we're doing something like an intelligence test, an IQ test, the number we use that says this means intellectual disability has moved,
Right.
right? It's not like it's always the same number. So if definitions are changing over time, and we can see that with a lot of different conditions, it means that who was sort of captured as belonging to one bucket, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, is different than how we understand the bucket now, which means that there are a lot of people, and some people maybe like joining us today might be experiencing that, where they actually think there's something going on with them that would describe them as being neurodivergent or different in that way. But it wasn't something that people understood when they were younger, or they were told, no, that can't be you. You can't have that condition when you're younger. But maybe the way we understand it now has shifted, right?
And in the name of clarity, are there some signs or some characteristics, like whether it's executive function or whether it's focus, that are kind of broadly associated that might encourage someone to say, oh, I wonder if my brain works a little differently? Like, are there kind of, indicators that are kind of broadly common that people might be experiencing or observing in a loved one that are kind of good
Yeah, it's
indicators in
tricky.
that
I
way?
mean,
Like, I know that's tricky because everyone is so individual, but in the name of clarity, are there ways to kind of hone in a little bit?
yeah, I mean, I think so. We have to think about, different neurodivergence just means different, right? But if we're
Yeah.
talking about a particular diagnosis or a particular condition, there might be some things that we're looking for. So we're thinking about social communication as an important aspect of an autism diagnosis. And it's not just how you communicate, it's how you're communicating and interacting kind of at the same time, because really those things go together. We're always communicating, with other people to sort of
Mhm.
express what it is that we're thinking or we're feeling. But there might be one person, I think we used to think, in the autism area, that folks had real difficulty. They didn't really feel emotions like other people. They had a kind of blunted or sort of robotic kind of way of expressing emotions or thinking about emotions or feeling emotions. And that's actually not true, right? So someone might feel things very intensely, and someone might have a real disconnect in terms of how they feel or understand emotions. And both of those people can have that same diagnosis of autism. And
Right.
ADHD also, what is ADHD? It's a bunch of letters that go together, right? So some people might have real attentional issues, and some people might have issues around hyperactivity, and some people might have both, right? And again, you bring in something like a person's gender or a person's culture or what their school classroom is shaped like, right? Like if you grow up in a house and you've got lots of kids and lots of things going on and you do a lot of work outside, that's very different than if you grow up in a very small apartment building and you have to be really quiet and like there's
Yeah.
just so there are a lot of variables that I think when you're looking at some of these conditions to see is this part of what's going on, you might be interested in like the history of what things are like when someone is a child, but you also want to understand what was that context, right?
It,
So a lot of kids, I think when they start school, that may be a time where we see certain things that maybe we missed earlier on. So some disabilities or some conditions we pick up quite early. Some we see at that change. Well, why do we see things in school? It's because we have a different set of expectations and different structures, right? We have different kinds of relationships. The way we play is a certain, way. The amount of minutes we have to sit still
yeah.
changes, right? The structure of our day, how much we're with our family versus without our family. So there's a shift that happens at a certain age. And then there's also shifts that happen like going from like elementary school, which might be more playful, structured in a certain way, to managing if you go into a big junior high school, right? And also the expectations when you leave school, when you leave home, those can change as well. So I think at different stages of our lives, different things happen to us that can be more or less supportive and might make things more evident or more obvious to other people or even to ourselves because the way most people seem to be doing something might be difficult or just might be different for somebody.
Well, and that's a nice lead in to the diagnosis process. I mean, what is like, it sounds like there's so many variables. A diagnosis can be a very helpful tool. Do you always need one? Like, what is the best tool of that diagnosis? And maybe a little bit about like what does that process look like for people in case they haven't embarked on that journey yet or it's something they're thinking about? What are some of the expectations around that?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question, why do we get diagnoses for things? So why,
Yeah.
if you have cancer, why do you want to get a diagnosis? I'm not suggesting that being neurodivergent is like cancer, but
Yeah.
like you get a diagnosis because you want to know why am I having these symptoms or these experiences and what are some things we can do about it, right? So if I have a way of thinking and I want to understand like who else is in a situation like that, right? What are some things we can do to make it easier for me to navigate things? Maybe I'm having trouble at school or at work, right? Maybe if there's a name that goes with it, I have a better understanding of what that means about me. Other people might have a different understanding. And also, there's things we can put in place. So, I mean, I feel really awful that I said cancer because it's absolutely not a cancer to be neurodivergent. But, thinking about again, like I wear glasses now. I needed to know that there was something that wasn't quite right with my vision or something that could be supported by glasses because now it's easier for me to do certain things. So if someone finds out, well, actually, it's harder for you to understand certain kinds of things, right? So you have a learning disability, you have an intellectual disability, you're autistic, the things that you find stressful in a big social situation might be different than other people, or the way you understand information might be different. So getting that diagnosis helps you um, to know, oh, that's what it is, one. And two, other people who've had the same experience have found this helpful or have found that helpful, right? So it's not to get rid of anything about who a person is, right? It's just more what are the things that would be helpful given that this is the way you think about and process information, for example.
Well, and when we have language to describe something, then hopefully the couple to that are tools for ourselves and to, communicate with other people what our needs are. Like, is that part of the evolution of that process is being able to identify, express, and receive our needs in the way that works best for us in
Yeah, I was
different
gonna say, and it's
situations.
let's so in an ideal world, 100%.
Yeah.
Right. So in an ideal world, that's what happens is we say, okay, well, here's what's going on. We call it this. Now we understand it in a certain way. Other people understand it in a certain way. And now your needs are going to be met. Well, does it always happen that
Yeah. I
way?
love this vision you're describing, Dr. Linsky.
That's where we want to go, right? But it's not always like that. So, first of all, maybe your needs can be met even without that medical diagnosis for some people, right? Like, why can't, if you think about a concept like universal design, what does universal design mean? It means we set things up so that anyone can manage and, various kinds of differences don't matter. This works for someone who, is using a wheelchair. This works for someone who can't hear as easily. So we make sure, for example, if you're watching a webinar like this, that there's captions, right? So that if you can't hear what's being said, you can read the captions. That would be something we do that helps everyone. Um, so sometimes we can do things that are helpful without a diagnosis, but also sometimes getting a diagnosis can feel harmful, right? Because it's again, you're this in the perfect world, you have a diagnosis and everyone understands it and we figure out what to do about it. But in the less than perfect world, you have a diagnosis and now everyone thinks, oh, well, that's all this person is, right? Like everything that's going on in them is because of this diagnosis, right? Or this diagnosis means they can't do X, they have this problem, they can't do that, they can't do that. And it feels kind of stigmatizing or harmful, right? So I think we need to go toward that space where when we have a diagnosis, people understand it and give people the support they need, and people can be, proud of having that extra understanding of who they are and kind of work with that information. But we have to make sure that information is there for everybody. So both for the person who gets a diagnosis, but for the other people around them, and just for public, for all of us, right?
Yeah. Can you talk just a little bit about how medication can sometimes be woven into this? Does, like, my daughter was on medication for ADHD. She's not anymore. I'm sure lots of people on the call today, either themselves or they know someone where medication has been brought up in the conversation. What do we need to know about that?
What do we need to know about medications? Wow. Okay, so that's a really big question. Maybe one thing I'll say is that there's many ways that we can help people with what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. There aren't really necessarily medications that sort of like to think about, even with maybe medication for ADHD, what it might be doing in that situation is if your daughter needs to participate in a certain activity and she's finding it hard to do that, there may be a medication that figures out which parts are hard and helps make it a little bit easier. So very simply, if you have to keep your attention and sit and focus on an activity and not have a lot of other ideas popping up that make you need to get up and go and do other things, the medication might help with that. Okay. You may be taking a medication because, in addition to the diagnosis that you have, there's other things that can go with that. So, someone who has an intellectual disability and it's caused by a particular genetic syndrome might have like a tendency to hurt themselves in a specific way. So, there's certain conditions that are associated with what we call self-injury. There might be a medication that helps deal with something at the sort of neuron level around pain that will make a certain behavior where a person's hurting themselves change a little bit,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
Or there might be a lot of anxiety that comes sometimes with having a particular condition. That condition or that neurodivergence isn't anxiety necessarily, but there's also anxiety, right? So maybe there's a medication that can help with that anxiety. So I think medication is part of maybe what could be within somebody's toolbox, but it really depends on the very specific things going on with them, what their goals are, or what it is that they want to be doing, and also what their environment is like.
And what's the first step if someone is interested in pursuing a diagnosis? Is it talking to their family doctor? What is the first step to take?
I think in a perfect world, again, if you have a family doctor, then that's a great person to talk to. And it may be sometimes maybe, I'm thinking about, for example, if you are uh, maybe I'm thinking about people that we might see in our clinic at the hospital. If you are a woman and you had certain kinds of struggles when you were younger, but you kind of knew what to do, what to say, and you figured out the sort of rules. Sometimes we call that masking. But you think maybe actually there's autism that's always been there, but you hadn't understood that before. So you might bring it up to your doctor and you're like, autism? I didn't really think that, we were diagnosing adults with autism, or I'm not so familiar with that. So you might have more information than they do in some situations, but it's still something you can talk about or explore a little bit together. But I think also doctors are learning things all the time. Like I said, things are changing. So something might have been missed before, or they might not know everything in your history, or there might be some things that you don't talk about. So definitely it's a really good first thing to do is to talk to your primary care provider. There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet, um, uh, some good, some bad. I think, it's amazing. You just like AI can tell you pretty much anything now, but also AI never says, I don't know, right? Or actually that part I'm not sure about, or I looked at this source and this source and they were conflicting. So I think it's really helpful sometimes to get information from the internet, but also it can be confusing and it might not be correct. And that's why it's good to talk with a healthcare provider. But there's also a lot of peer support that I think if you find the right sort of group or connection, there's other people who've thought about these same things you might be thinking about, and there might be information that's helpful. But again, everyone's different, and I would say always probably good to start if it is a diagnosis that you need to get to talk with your doctor.
Well, and I just want to reassure our guests that are joining us today that in the follow-up from this webinar, there will be a CAMH toolkit with some additional resources along with the recording of this. So we will be following up with something that will offer some more support and, as people move forward with their curiosity around this topic. You mentioned something about anxiety a minute ago where the anxiety and the ADHD was almost like a which came first. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the mental health and the intersection of that with neurodiversity. And we were talking before we came on. I was sharing that a dear friend of mine got a diagnosis of ADHD in her 40s and said it released years of shame off her shoulders. And, she really talked about this deep intersection between her mental health and this piece of clarity. Where do you also see, like in your clinic, like where does the mental health component, impact people?
Yeah, and there's maybe a few ways to look at it, right? So I think if you're neurodivergent, so you have a condition that makes you different than other people, and the way other people think of that is kind of harmful, then that can make you feel awful. And that's kind of the example you were giving about your friend, right? Who didn't have a
Yeah,
diagnosis until later, but there were things that she did that were different, and she just felt really, really bad, years of
that's
that.
exactly right.
So I think people can have experiences either with how others people do understand what's going on with them or don't understand it at them that can affect their mental health. Um, Sorry, I think my computer froze for one moment, but we're back. You're
Yeah,
back.
you're good. You're good.
Okay. The other thing that can happen, so for some conditions, so I work mostly with folks who have intellectual disabilities and autistic people, and they have higher rates of mental health issues than other individuals. So there could be like brain-based things that are going on that make them more susceptible to certain mental health conditions, but there can also be a lot of psychosocial things. So it could be that kind of stigma is a huge issue. You could have mental health issues tied to maybe having a lot of isolation, not having, the things that make us feel good in our day to day, help us with our mental health. And if you don't have those same opportunities, then that can also affect your mental health. If you don't have as high an income and can't, have work or participate in school, all those kinds of things have effects. So, and then I think to make things worse sometimes is that, traditionally how we give mental health care is we think about how we would give mental health care to most people, to the sort of typical person. Well, if you learn differently, if you process things differently, if you talk about things differently, it may mean that how we deliver our mental health care needs to change a little bit as well. Right? So first we have to recognize there's a mental health issue. It's not just this condition, whatever it is. So we talk about something called diagnostic overshadowing, where we're literally like missing out. This is anxiety, this is depression. And we're like, no, no, that's just the person has Down syndrome. That's all that is, right? Down syndrome people do that, right? As an example. It's like, no, no, there's other stuff too. So we have to recognize that other stuff. We have to think about how it interacts with, this condition that we're calling neurodivergence, whatever it is. And then we also have to adapt what we want to get mental health care to everyone, like quickly as we should, but it might have to be adapted. And sometimes that's a bit tricky for people to do.
We're getting ready to move to the Q&A part, so I just want to remind people that if they have a question to pop it in the chat. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. Um, you mentioned the stigma there for a minute, Dr. Lunsky, and I'm wondering what are some of the myths that you would like to see disbanded? Like I'm thinking of things like the myth of like if I'm neurodivergent, I will never have love. What are some of those really like kind of big assumptions that are so antiquated and dated, we just want to bust them all right out of the water about the kind of life that we can have as neurodivergent people?
Right. Well, again, I mean, I think keeping in mind neurodivergence is such a
Yes.
broad thing, right?
Yeah,
But I think
yeah,
the whole general myth that there's a certain way everybody is supposed to be is
yeah.
what
Let's
I
just
think I'm
crack it
getting at,
all,
right?
right?
Like, let's just recognize people do things differently. But I think there's specific kinds of, I know again, working with folks who have intellectual disabilities, there's this idea that, well, they can't work or they can't love, right? They
Mhm.
shouldn't be able to, we think some people are more able to have sex than other people, right? Or more people are interested in intimate relationships than other people. Well, is that really the case, right? We think that some people can't learn, right? So if there's no point teaching that person because they can't learn. It's like, no, 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 I think they just learn differently.
Yeah.
Maybe we have to try to do this in a different way, right? So what we value and what we think is important also needs to change, right? What makes people worthy or worthwhile or good people? So I think there's sort of myths or ideas we have about what that kind of person is, and I think we have to broaden that.
Yeah, because I think
Um,
some people might worry, like parents might worry that their child won't be able to have a job that will self-sustain them. And, there is this need to know that it's all going to be okay.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's important, especially for like, I think we all do this if we're parents or if we're aunts or uncles, grandparents, and we're thinking about this little person and what it's going to be for them. All we have is to look at what we see in people right now. And when we see people who are adults right now or older adults right now, we have to remember that they grew up in a different culture, context, time than these little people we're thinking
Mm.
about right now. So where people are going to go and what they're going to do, you know, it, disability or being different, it's not so much just something that's in a person. It's about how that person is interacting with everyone else and in that broader environment or society, right? So it's all of our jobs to change the broader environment and society and not just the individual. And there's a lot of things people can do if we set up the context right, right?
What are
So,
some things you think you'd like us to do?
well, I'd like us to be nicer.
Yeah.
I'm
Step
serious. I
one.
think
Yeah.
kindness is a huge one, right?
Yeah.
Like be kind to people. Be kind. You don't have to be everybody's best friend, but be nice, and feel proud of being able to speak up if you see other people who are not being nice, right? And remember that there's more than one way of doing something. And make sure you are a little bit more flexible in what you think people should be doing or could be doing. Think about different ways you can let different people participate in your neighborhood, in your community, in your family. And don't be shy about asking questions, like um, I find I grew up with a sister with an intellectual disability, and I mean obviously people are mean and that sucks, and I wish no people were ever like that. But also some people had questions and they probably felt like, well, I can't ask that question. That's a terrible thing. It's ask, like be curious, be willing to learn things, new things, be open to the idea that you might make a mistake and that's okay, and be nice. I think if everyone was curious and nice, that would be a really good start.
Well, I was going to ask about, strength-based, affirming care and stuff, but I think you're summing it up so beautifully, which is like, let's just start by being nice and not so judgy McJudge-a-lot, and let's just, move forward with an open heart and kindness. It sounds so simple, but like, really, isn't that what will open doors of like conversation and making our world just a little bit gentler for everybody?
For sure. And then maybe the other thing that goes with that, which I think does fit with the sort of what does like neuroaffirming care look like, is who knows best, right? Like I know what I need and what will be helpful to me. And if I and I can even start to figure those things out when I'm young. So let's help people figure out what they need and let's include those people in the things that we're doing. So if we want to build a classroom that's inclusive, if we want to build a workplace that's inclusive, please don't assume that you know the answer of what that means. Like engage with the people who are going to be impacted by it, right? To figure it out and have trustworthy ways of working together, be allowed to make some mistakes and kind of work through them. And yeah, and then things I think can be better. So there isn't one way to deliver therapy. There isn't one way to have a healthcare appointment. There isn't one way to learn in a classroom, right? So
This is our final question before we get into the Q&A, but I'm wondering what is fueling your optimism about the future? And I'm actually wondering about, I feel like we're seeing more and more examples in pop culture of characters. I'm thinking of Becca in the Pit. I'm thinking of Shane Hollander in Heated Rivalry, of characters that are, complex and interesting and coming with neurodivergency. Like, what is making you excited about the
So,
future?
so that is making me excited, right? Like I just saw today, I think Disney is coming out with a couple of their animated films with certain musical sequences where the characters, instead of just singing, they're using sign language, right? Like these things are cool and these are like in what we do, right? So there's that shift. I think having a talk like this and knowing people actually showed up, I think people showed up, Donna. It's not just you and I, right? So that's kind of exciting that this is important, that when we talk about mental health, we're recognizing everyone's mental health and not just one group's. Um, and yeah, and this sort of again this curiousness and also who's at the table. So I'm a researcher. Part of what I do is I study things. So I used to study people with some of these conditions, but now like those people are studying those things alongside me, right? So that's a real change. So we're changing how we think about things because we're giving people opportunities so they can get involved in driving even the science of what we're doing so that we do things differently. And I see that in education as well. Like I teach at the university, I'm involved in the med school, and the students who are coming in want to learn things differently. They have learning differences and identify themselves sometimes as being neurodivergent. Like that changes things, right? When people can
Yeah.
be who they are, and when we grow up in communities where people are all different ways, then we want to change things. And so it's not like one lone voice saying, I wish people would change things, like people are just doing it and they're open to it. And I think that's really exciting.
It is exciting. I'm going to bring us into the Q&A because it's lighten up.
All right.
So we're having a lot of questions coming in, Dr. Lunsky, about executive function and what exactly that is and what it looks like. Can you maybe just paint a picture of what executive function means for people? Because that's a term that I think gets thrown around. I know I heard it when my daughter was in it was a school age kid a lot. What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's kind of like the coordination of all the different activities in the brain, right? So if you think about, there's lots of things that we all have ideas of things we want to say, but some things we're not supposed to say at certain times. Right? So the executive functioning might help us say, okay, pause on that one. This context, this is a better thing to say, right? It's also like organization. Where are things, right? So if executive functioning, sometimes you might not be able to find like actual stuff you're supposed to be doing, or what was your plan? What was the thing you were just doing? So it's not so much memory, but it's how everything kind of gets organized together. If you think about it, our brain has lots of information in it, right? So how does it kind of get organized? What's the file system look like? And how easy is it to pull out the right file at the right time? It's that overarching sort of bringing it all together.
So that could come out in communication. It could come out in managing a series of tasks. It could come out in, um, school, like getting schoolwork done in a reasonable amount of time. Like it could really take all kinds of forms. That's what I hear you saying as
Yeah,
well.
and as we have more demands, you know, like sometimes, with all of us, like sometimes we just, our executive functioning can go on like pause or like light mode or something because there's just not that much there you need to worry about. But then in some situations, there's a lot of things that have to happen. So the executive functioning becomes really important in those situations, right? Or sometimes your executive functioning is going okay, but there's a little bit of overdrive because now there's anxiety coming in at the same time, right? And then there's like a lot of other stuff happening. And then you just had these big life events that have also impacted you. And you're also not feeling well and you had poor sleep, right? So just imagine again this kind of central thing that's trying to hold it all together with all these pressures and things that are coming up on it, it can make it harder. So even if you have difficulties with your executive functioning in some situations and with some supports, your executive functioning doesn't have to work as hard as it might in other.
Right. Excellent. Very clear. So we're getting some really thoughtful questions, and one is about for someone who might, identify as neurotypical, how can they support and be helpful to someone who maybe has not yet understood their own needs and characteristics? Like this person's asking about how, if I'm supporting someone who doesn't really yet know what tools or awareness are best for them, how can I best support them as they move through this journey?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that we all can benefit from kind of greater literacy around what some of these things mean. So
Hmm.
there's things that we can, and there's also always things that we can do to be more supportive of other people that doesn't require them to do anything differently, right? Like one thing that comes up often, again, I'm more familiar with some, like I say, I work more in the area of autism and intellectual disability. I don't work with every sort of type of neurodivergence, but there's a conversation happening in the autism community that says, like, how much is it that two autistic people like working and communicating together do great. Two typical people, neurotypical people communicating together, they do great. And then when we have these two folks working together from these different ways of thinking, then there's a little bit of a problem sometimes, right? But why is it on the person who's autistic to have to change what they're doing and not on the other person? So I think it's great
Yeah.
that this question is coming up. How can I be more supportive? But recognizing some people change, like people change in different ways and at different paces, and people are also at different stages in their journey. And maybe some of the work is the work that we have to do as opposed to work that they have to do, right?
Yeah.
So and there's a time and a place, right? Like I think it can be really difficult if you're figuring something out for yourself and then someone else kind of knows better than you and you weren't asking for that. So I think
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of sensitivity in those kinds of conversations. But I think, again, asking the person what would be helpful is probably what did we say before? It's important to be nice, kind, and curious, right? So be curious about what kinds of things might be helpful and ask those questions and be really nice. And maybe that's a good start.
We have another, this is a question about hereditariness. Are autism or ADHD hereditary, pardon me? Are you born neurodivergent or are symptoms inherited over time from experience and environmental factors? And this person's also sharing how three of their children have been diagnosed with autism and ADHD. And after doing their assessments, they saw themselves, the mother saw herself in the checklist and is now wondering if there's a hereditary or a genetic link.
Yeah. So I think that again, people are the way they are because of this interaction between, genetics and environment. But
Yeah.
certainly I think there's something going on genetically where some things are more apparent or more likely to be apparent within families as opposed to just like random, right? But there's many things that can contribute to that. I will say there are a lot of, for example, and again in the autism space, more mothers, for example, and sometimes fathers, after a child gets a diagnosis, saying, "Oh, well, maybe that's also I do things like that. No one ever told me that was called this, right?" Like, so
Happened in
that,
my own house. Yes.
yeah, so that happens. That happens, right? And there's also kind of like, again, what is it that makes someone have a diagnosis? It's like a constellation of symptoms at a certain level that it sort of meets a bar, and we say you have X. But other people might have like bits of those symptoms or things going on, but not meeting that bar. And so we don't say they have X. So,
Right.
and genes are kind of like that as well, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so I don't know. I hope that's helpful. I think we're still learning about all these things. And again, remember how we defined or what we called a particular diagnosis or condition 10 or 20 years ago might be different from what we're saying now, and it might be different from what we understand or say 5 years from now as well.
A lot of people are asking about how to best advocate for themselves with their family doctor. Like, is there a credible online ADHD symptom checklist or characteristic checklist, for example? People are feeling maybe ignored or unheard with their providers. So, wondering about the best way to self advocate or advocate for our loved ones.
Okay, yeah. So whether we're trying to think about how we have a conversation with our doctor about ourselves or maybe about a family member, and again, trying not to get too kind of diagnosis specific on this. And I'm not an ADHD expert as an example, right? But there are
Mhm.
some things I think that are important. One is, there's different approaches we can have when we go into any healthcare setting, right? So they have a set amount of time, they have a set of experiences. We can go in really combative and say, here's what we need, you're wrong, blah, 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 blah. Did we set up the context for that situation as best we could? What information, what might be helpful to them? Can we be organized in our thoughts and the things we want to talk about? So sometimes having things written down, and so you're kind of prepared for that conversation. I think some people only know us at one moment in time, right? So again, I went back to my own experiences in terms of what I'm more able to do clinically, but I might see someone present today. I don't know what they were like as a kid, right? So that's really important context, especially for conditions that have a kind of developmental history. So when we do an autism diagnosis, we really want to understand what things were like in those earlier years. And so we would want to have information from someone else besides the person who's kind of presenting or talking about the issues. So thinking about the history that might be helpful for one of these conversations. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of what else could be helpful. I mean, I think preparing ourselves for appointments is so important. Like, I don't know what it's like for you, Donna, but like when you go into a stressful medical situation, whether it's about a neurodivergence type diagnosis or any kind of health issue, if it's really important to you and it's anxiety provoking, all the things you mean to say don't come out in that moment,
So
right?
true.
So
Yeah.
sometimes like having stuff written down in advance, having someone with you to the appointment, seeing if the appointment can be a bit longer, seeing if you might have like a better time of day. So I know for folks with intellectual disabilities who have a harder time being in a healthcare appointment, making the appointment first thing, right? Or making it when it's quieter. So there's lots of things to think about in the context of that situation that go beyond just like, what are you doing when you're making this
Yeah.
diagnosis,
And
right?
is there a bit of would you say it's fair to perhaps have an expectation of persistence? Like you may be in a situation where you have many appointments, or you have to, like, I know when I was advocating at my child's school, it wasn't one conversation, it was several conversations. And that's just a little bit of what we can kind of anticipate as we go into these conversations sometimes, is it might not be one and done.
Right, yeah. So it's like a marathon, not a sprint, not one and done. So I think having that understanding of what is the process to getting a kind of diagnosis like this, what's the context? How do I get ready for that? Who's on my team to help me do this? How do I prepare for knowing that probably I may need to explain the same things over and over again or to different people, right? So how's that information organized, right? Did I have something good to eat today before I did this, right? Do I have something nice I can do after this if I think it's going to be a stressful experience? But I think, yeah, having that kind of context for what it's like to get a diagnosis can, I think, be helpful for people.
We have another question around advocacy, advocating for ourselves, and this one specifically with children. And I know this is something a lot of people can relate to. Is how do you navigate and advocate for your child when what you see at home is very different than what's being communicated or seen at school, and the child has gotten very good at masking. So, it sounds like maybe this parent is experiencing that the school is not listening or really hearing what they are experiencing with their child, and are looking for some collaboration and cooperation. What is your experience with dealing? I know this is not your area of expertise, but someone's asking about, like, how do you navigate the school system and the education system when you are, trying to advocate for your child and the behavior at home is different than the behavior at school?
Yeah. Okay. So one thing I'll say, remember I was saying this before when I talked about like not walking into that appointment, whether it's with a doctor or an employer or a school, right? Like combative is one strategy and sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't, right? So everyone's on the same team. If we start with thinking that, how can we be on the same team? What are we all into? We're all interested in the child, right? But we all see things in different ways. So sometimes I talk about like we have different cameras. And so as a family caregiver, you have like that big close-up camera, right? Like you see everything, you know everything about that child in that situation, but you don't see all the other kids in the classroom. And you don't
Yeah.
have a camera that goes into the classroom, right? The teacher has this like little like wide lens camera that like sees everybody. You know, I've seen lots and lots of kids of that age, sees all the kids in the class, but doesn't get that close-up look of what your family member is like, you know, at home, for example, or in other settings. It's always really interesting to find out, do we see this in every setting or do we see it in certain settings? Right? And if we only see it in certain settings, then it's really, well, why, right? What is different about this setting versus that setting? And sometimes it's that one setting feels a little more supportive, or one setting has a bit more like sensory demands, or it's the time of day, right? Like one part of the day is just an easier time of the day. Some people are not awake first thing in the day, and whoever sees them is going to have trouble. And then later they're better, right? Or other people put all their energy into the first part of their day. So this word masking is an interesting word, and it's used sometimes to reflect that people know there's a certain way they have to behave or be, and they use all their energy to like do that exact thing they're supposed to do for a certain amount of time, right? So it might be school, it might be work, and then they come home and it's just like, right?
Yeah.
Mask is off, right? And so you're seeing a different person almost in those two situations. And it takes a lot of energy. If we think about a battery as a metaphor, it might take that whole person's battery to be in this one setting. So when they get to this other setting, there's not much battery left, right? So I think understanding those different perspectives and having those complementary cameras or camera lenses or whatever is a really helpful way to get the whole person. Um, but yeah, people don't know what they don't know. They don't see other things. So finding ways to make it more apparent and to have people understand different perspectives is important.
Similarly, we've got a lot of really great conversations coming in around the workplace. So I'm going to ask it in two parts so you can answer the first part first and the second part. So lots of employers asking, where can I go to find resources and educate my employees, my organization, about neurodivergencies in employees and create a more supportive work environment?
What a great question. Thank you, all the employers listening, right? So I think that's something we can try to share some resources in a bit of a summary, and some resources we'll do after the talk today. But there are different groups here in Canada and around the world who are looking specifically at sort of resources and ways to make workplaces more neuro-inclusive. It's another neuro word. And again, it's recognizing people think in different ways, right? And we might think that, you know, everybody knows all the, you know, unspoken rules about how to be in the workplace. Well, if they're unspoken, then probably everyone doesn't know them, right? And who made
Yeah.
those rules? Are
Yeah.
those the right rules, right? Is that fair? Should everyone do those rules? Because only one group of people made them and not another group. So how do
And
we bring out people's best in the workplace? And I think, you know, thinking about people's access needs is really important, and not like, and thinking about how we ask those questions, assume everybody is coming in and is neurodivergent, right? So the first thing we want to find out from them is how do we meet their access needs better? Again, whether it's a neurodevelopmental kind of thing, it could be a physical thing, it could be whatever. Like, people manage and work in different ways. What do you need to do your best at work? And then how can we adapt things so that we can bring out the best in you and everybody else? What would be helpful? And then like continuing to talk about it. So it's not like you hand in this sheet of paper your first day and that is you forever, because you don't even know what you're going to be like at work until you've shown up there, right? So being able to sort of have like repeated conversations and thinking about ways, you know, sometimes it's how everyone's interacting together, right? So like it's on everyone to change things. It's not just on one person to try to change things. But I think as leaders in organizations, I think we can model those things, right? By making sure what we do is accessible, thinking again about universal design. But there are some nice resources out there. And certainly I think in the area of autism as an example, this is April. It's the end of autism, sort of autism acceptance month. And there's lots of resources that I'm seeing being shared right now that can be helpful.
couple of final questions before we close today. What are some best practices for supporting neurodivergent clients in a strength-based and client-centered way?
So like in healthcare settings, for
I
example.
think so, yeah. It's probably, I think I'm thinking of lots of client-centered, industries, but maybe some sort of
Yeah. Yeah,
macro.
overarching thing. So there's one,
Yeah.
and well, maybe I'll include the resource for this after. There's a really nice acronym that's come from the autistic community, actually from a group called Autistic Doctors International, and it's the SPACE acronym. And each letter in space stands for different aspects of ways to make things more neuroaffirming. And so I can share that resource tomorrow, but I know that I have to say, I know I'm going to get one of the letters wrong, but it's thinking about like the sensory space, the physical space, different aspects of how we make things more accessible to people. But I think remembering, we assume, for example, I do therapy. We assume it should be 50 minutes and the person should sit opposite for you for 50 minutes and you should talk.
Mhm.
That works for some people, but there's a reason why not everyone stays in therapy, right?
Yeah.
So, can I take off my shoes? Can I walk around? Can I type my thoughts instead of writing my thoughts, right? Can we have like a therapy that takes place in small spurts, but it happens completely asynchronously? Right?
Mm.
Some people, have a conversation and then they leave the room, everything leaves their mind, right? So can I actually have a person as one of my sort of access needs supports? Another person here with me who's kind of like my note taker, my rememberer, my person who helps me feel more comfortable in this situation, my person who can help me answer certain questions and also who remembers what my homework is and what I'm supposed to do later, right? Or
Yeah.
actually, I don't want to talk at all. Can we do art?
Yeah.
Can we like walk? Can we like do a little bit of therapy, but it's connected to an activity or something I'm really interested in that I love, that I feel good about? So I think being neuroaffirming, that's therapy, but you could bring some of those principles to other kinds of things as well. And remember that there's not just one way to do things and to look to that person to see what makes them comfortable. And to remember that all the rules we think everybody knows, some people don't know, or some people have a harder time following those rules. So do we really need those rules to be exactly in that way?
You're making me think of, how accommodations in education has become something that is more prevalent. But as you're talking, I'm like, well, even the word accommodations is not great because it implies something, special, or
Yeah, yeah. We
do you
have
know
to
what I mean?
accommodate you.
We
There's
have to
something wrong
accommodate you.
here that will accommodate you. We'll do,
Yeah,
and it's like, no, no, no. Here's my needs, right? We
exactly.
meet people's needs. That's again, I go to this idea of universal design. There are things we do that helps everybody. And if we did more of that, we wouldn't have, so many people saying that they need to be accommodated, right? And that the onus is on them. I think the onus is on all of us.
It's our universal onus. And our
Yeah.
final question, Dr. Lenski, is someone who identifies as autistic has asked how we fight the stigma around autism and push for further education in the general population on the topic of autism.
Right. Well, I think we need to share the mic. I think that probably autistic people need to be at the center of those conversations and solving some of those problems, but not by themselves. So I know I just came last week actually from a really nice national conference that was focused on autism. And the big theme there was kind of nothing about us without us, right? Which is an expression we hear a
Oh,
lot in
I
the
love
broader
that.
disability community. But it's like you gotta make sure that the people who the thing is about are centered in the conversation and leading the way of those things. But it's not their job to lead alone, right? Like, is it always the autistic person's job to say, actually, autism means this, or actually, I would have
Mm.
loved, again, going back to like things with my sister when I was a kid, I would have loved it if it wasn't always me that had to say, please don't use the R word,
Yeah.
right? Like, so I think the way we change things is we make sure that the people who know the most what needs to change are at the center, but that the other people that we can be allies in this, right? And that we're stepping in, we're saying we want to make changes as well, and we're working together.
I think that's a beautiful place to leave this conversation today, Dr. Lenski. We could go on and on and on, but our time is up. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a grounding and generous and really beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh,
Thank you
thanks,
for
Donna.
Thank you for everyone behind the scenes, the team at CAMH. It truly takes a village to put these events together. So thank you to everyone there. And thank you to everyone who joined us today live and put in your very thoughtful questions, and people who are joining us after the fact. It means so much to us that you are joining us for these conversations. Maybe this has brought a bit more clarity to your life. Maybe it's made you a bit more curious. Maybe you're just starting to find the language to, look at things differently. And certainly, I hope everyone is leaving with the message of let's just be a little nicer and a little more open. And that is really the first step to change the world. I hope everyone is leaving with a little more. optimism and sunshine in their life. As I said, CAMH will follow up with a toolkit with resources that you can use to support you on your continued journey. And if today resonated with you and you believe in expanding this kind of affirming care, evidence-based mental health care for neurodivergent people and their families, um, CAMH is always here to help, and every gift ensures that people get the mental health support when they need it. Before you go, there's always one more little thing. Please, there'll be a little survey that comes up. I promise you, it just takes a couple of minutes. These are so helpful in terms of making sure that these webinars give you what you are hoping for and what is most valuable. Thank you again for joining us today on behalf of everyone at CAMH. Wishing you a beautiful rest of your day. Take care.